The single most terrible sin at the gaming table is metagaming. Metagamers are the cheaters and horrible role players in the games that we love to play. As GMs, we need to eliminate these players from our hobby. Or do we? Is metagaming always bad? Wikipedia defines metagaming as any strategy, action, or method used in a game which transcends a prescribed rule set, uses external factors to affect the game, or goes beyond the supposed limits or environment set by the game. Now, in common usage in RPGs, metagaming is basically when a character acts on information that the player has, but the character does not. Now, typically, metagaming has negative connotations with it and is considered a very bad thing at the table. But is that really what metagaming means, though? The Angry GM points out that meta is just a prefix for lots of different words and means something that lies outside of a thing but gives it structure. Take the word metaphysics, for example. Metaphysics are the hidden rules of the universe, the rules outside of physics, but on which those rules of physics are built. So metagaming is used by game designers and hardcore players as the rules and structures that, although are outside of the game, they're still what the rules of the game are based on. Metagaming is really the foundation of RPGs. Things like strategy, game balance, the social contract between all the players and the GM, a non-competitive experience, and collaborative storytelling. Those are the metagame. But you didn't click on this video expecting a discussion on the foundations of RPGs, so we'll be using the common gamer definition in this episode. Now, as some of you may have gathered, I'm a realist, and I believe that metagaming is going to happen probably every session in some form or another. Some small, some major, some good, some bad, and it's up to us as GMs to figure out how to mitigate the bad and increase the good metagaming. My name is Mike, and this is the Game Master's Vault, and in today's episode, we're going to talk all about metagaming. I'll give you some common examples that we'll find of metagaming at the table, what causes metagaming, how to lessen the effects, the negative effects of metagaming, how we as GMs metagame, and how to get around it. So, without further ado, let's go to the vault and find out all about metagaming. All right, so we'll start today's discussion by giving you some examples of what metagaming is and how it happens at our table. I've come up with 7 different quick examples of what metagaming is for you to understand it a little better. First of all, the most common way that metagaming we see at our tables is through monster knowledge. A player knows something about a monster, whether it's their strengths or weaknesses, and their character would not know that, and they use their player knowledge to give an advantage to their character. A couple different examples of this is troll regeneration. Now, the player knows that you need fire or acid to stop the regeneration of trolls, and they either tell the other players or they just start lobbing acid and fire at the troll themselves. This is metagaming if the character would not have had any way to have this knowledge about troll regeneration. Another example is how to kill a vampire. Things that work great against vampires: garlic, silver, chopping their head off, wooden stake through the heart. destroying their coffin or the dirt that's in their coffin so they can't rest. It's one thing to know whether you're talking about any kind of monster. Because we're basically all nerds at the table, we read a lot. We watch TV. We watch movies all about the things that we like, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi, whatever. And we're going to have knowledge from other sources. It may not be the particular stats of a vampire that we may know, but we know all the things about garlic and silver and wooden stakes and all that kind of stuff just from movies and reading books and things like that. It's still out of character knowledge that they're using for their in-character play, and which causes it to be metagaming. Another example of metagaming, number 2, is the sleeping character. If one of the characters, if say Tony is asleep and the other parties, the rest of the party is interacting with an NPC or engaged, starting to engage in a fight, for example, Tony wakes up, and now all of a sudden, because the player heard the conversation that was going on, the fight, the interaction with the NPC, now Tony uses that player information for the actions of his character. Even though his character wasn't there, he was sleeping during the whole portion of the game. Number 3, using world knowledge of a dead character they played previously. Let's say the players are 5th level, one of the characters dies, they roll up a new character, and now everything that their previous character knew about the world, about certain shops, about NPCs, etc., now they have all that knowledge and they use that knowledge even though their new character would not have any of that knowledge. Again, this is metagaming. 4, this is a huge pet peeve of mine, flat out cheaters. If they are pre-reading the adventure or playing the adventure again with a new character, they go and watch YouTube sessions of other people playing the same adventure that they're in the middle of playing. These are just flat out cheaters. They're doing it to know what's coming ahead. They're reading monster stats, NPC interactions, and motivations so that they know as a player how to get the most information, the most loot, to be the most effective in combat that their character can, and they're using that completely for an unfair advantage for their character. Number 5 is how players can bend the rules a little bit, and there's 3 different ways that they can do this. When players play with a certain GM for a certain amount of time, they get to know some of the nuances of that particular game master, how they run the game, how they put out their encounters and their story. And the first way is if the player adjusts their character's actions based on foreknowledge of the long-term intentions of the GM. You should have already talked about the major themes and tones and the overall arcing story that you're going to be playing with your players, just to make sure that you've got the right interest and the right players. So they're going to create their characters, they're going to adjust their character actions based on all that knowledge. If your game is heavy on undead, their actions are going to be geared more toward fighting undead. Secondly, and kind of closely related, is when they power game during character creation. If they know that undead are going to be prevalent in the game, they create their characters and take certain flaws or liabilities that they know in this particular game are not going to be fully exploited by the game master. Therefore, they're getting extra creation options without paying some kind of corresponding penalty. This is another example of course, metagaming. And another way that they bend the rules is by basing a character's decision on knowledge of the game mechanics of the system to gain an advantage when the resulting action really goes against any of the character's personality, history, or motives. Number 6, as an example of metagaming, is bringing real-world knowledge into the game by the player. Let's say, for example, you're playing in a fantasy setting where guns do not exist, and your player wants to bring their knowledge of chemistry, their player knowledge, into the game, that their character can start to create black powder. That's metagaming. It doesn't work like that. Number 7 is a really good example of metagaming. This is the paladin and the thief. The paladin, of course, is lawful good, and the thief is chaotic evil or neutral evil, whatever. And basically what happens in this kind of metagaming, it's not specifically a player against the game or a player against the GM. This is player versus player metagaming. The thief is evil, and he steals something out of the paladin's backpack one night while he's sleeping. Now, the players know whether or not this was successful and will assume that it was successful. But the character doesn't know that. The paladin was sleeping. He didn't make his perception check to notice that the thief was going through his belongings. This is going to cause a lot of problems, and it's specifically called player-on-player metagaming, and it's a whole different topic that we'll go into here in a little bit. So those are some great examples of what causes metagaming, or examples of metagaming. And now let's go into what causes metagaming. I believe that the major cause, the one main cause of metagaming within your game, is that there are problems in your game. That metagaming is not the problem. Metagaming is a symptom of a problem. It's springtime here now, and so all of the trees are budding, and all of the mold when the snow goes away, and the flowers popping up and everything. So if you have allergies, you are going to start sneezing and coughing and have watery eyes and runny nose and those kind of things. Those are symptoms. The problem is that you have allergies. The sneezing and the runny nose and the watery eyes, those are symptoms, and that's the same way in our game. If we have an underlying problem within our game, a symptom that we have a problem is that your players start to metagame. So here are 3 common problems that I've come up with, and there's probably many more, but 3 of them that I was able to come up with relatively quickly. First of all, if you have a lack of communication within your game between the players and the GM about their expectations of the game, about what metagaming is, what level of metagaming is going to be appropriate, those are the kinds of communication problems that could cause metagaming. Now, if you have a power gamer as one of your players and a relatively new player, they're going to have 2 different ways of understanding and using metagaming knowledge, and there's going to be a huge disconnect between the 2 of them as to what level is acceptable and what is not. A power gamer is going to, of course, have more experience. They're going to know more about monsters as a player than the newbie would. And that's just going to increase the tension that's at your table. It's going to cause problems. And if your table is full of brand new players, metagaming isn't as bad because you're using metagaming and they are using metagaming to learn the rules, to learn how to play the game, to learn how to role play better, those kind of things. Now, as long as it's brought to their attention that, okay, what you're doing right now is metagaming, and it's typically frowned upon at most tables, but in this case, it's a beneficial thing because you're learning how to play the game better. You're learning strategy and tactics, those kind of things, as a good role player should already know. But since you don't know them, we're giving you the benefit of the doubt. Okay, the second problem that causes metagaming is a lack of trust between the game master and the players. For example, at your table, you have a player that wants to make an insight check or a sense motive check on an NPC to see if they're telling the truth. And you have them roll, and they roll somewhere in the middle of the road. Let's say they roll a 12, for example, and you just tell the player that their character assumes that the NPC is telling the truth. Well, that was kind of a midline roll. So they may still have suspicions about that NPC and whether or not they're really telling the truth, and they may want to keep harping at it, even though you've already told them, no, you believe that they're telling the truth. So one way to combat this lack of trust, I do this in my games, but I've never explicitly told my players that I do this, and I will be doing this from now on during session 0. Tell them, as a GM, I will never lie to your player. As a GM, I will never lie to your player. If you make a roll, I will flat out tell you if they're being truthful, not truthful, those kind of things. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying that an NPC won't lie to your character or intentionally mislead your character. I'm saying, as a GM, I will not lie to you as a player. So hopefully that will build some more trust. And as you play longer with that particular group, you'll build more trust as well. And that will help with some of the problems that can cause metagaming. The final one is the biggest one, I think. Great game-breaking lies and secrets are going to cause major problems that cause metagaming within your campaigns. Just like we talked about before, the paladin and the evil thief. Now, those two characters should never have been in the same party to begin with. An evil character with the rest of the party being a bunch of goody two-shoes, and especially with a paladin whose sole purpose is to root out and eradicate evil. Basically, that thief deceived and lied his way into this party and has been keeping it a secret. When players keep secrets from each other and not working together, this also causes problems. And where there's player versus player metagaming, you can see exactly where the problem lies. The problems, again, are not the metagaming. The symptoms is the metagaming. So when you see metagaming at your table, when it starts to creep up, look at it closely. What are they metagaming? Why are they metagaming? And that will point you to the problem that you most likely have created in your game. All right, so we've discussed some examples of metagaming and what causes metagaming. Now let's talk about two different things. One is how your players, how you can help your players to stop metagaming, and then how you as the GM can help mitigate the metagaming at your table. So first of all, helping your players work around this whole metagaming issue. I've come up with 3 basic things. First of all, you should, if this becomes a problem out of game, you should sit them down and show them, work with them on how they can rationalize this out of character knowledge to in-character actions. So if the character is very vocal, they're very inquisitive, they're always asking questions, then they can get the information. So this would be like the character that was sleeping and didn't know exactly what was going on. If their character asks questions all the time, they're going to get that information from the other players. So that would give them reason to have that knowledge. The second one, you should always make sure that they know that they should always be asking you, would my character know anything about this situation or monster, whatever? GM Alex P. online suggests one way to approach this is actually explicitly defining the stakes of a check before the roll. Spell out the consequences and successes and failures and give them a chance to commit to it or suggest an alternative to clarify the goal of their action. And this can solve a number of commonly reoccurring communication problems that we talked about before. So for example, the player would like to have an insight check to see if an NPC is lying. The GM will say, okay, the DC is 15. If you succeed, I'll tell you whether they're lying or not. And if you fail, I'm not going to say anything else. Player says, all right. And they roll a 9. And they guess they really don't know. The answer, of course, is nope. You might as well flip a coin. You don't know if they're telling the truth or not. Another example, a player would like to make a knowledge skill to read some ancient runes, for example. The GM says, okay, if you succeed, I'll tell you 2 things. If you fail, you just can't read the runes. Well, the player says, I don't know, that seems kind of boring. Can't I at least glean some information? So you reply, okay, I'll tell you 2 things regardless. But if you fail, one of them will be false. Sounds much more exciting. The third thing is to help them understand character versus player knowledge and to realize that the character lives in this world. They've grown up in this world, and in many cases they know more than the player would about their surroundings. So when it comes to metagaming, that's typically player knowledge and how that affects the character. The exact opposite could also be true because the character may know more than the player does about a certain subject, topic, monster, whatever, and they're the ones giving the information to the player, basically, is how that works. That's exactly why we roll dice. That's why we have numbers and rules in our game. If you think about it, really what it boils down to is the characters live in this world. If your character is standing in front of a hill giant, they're going to know a lot more than the player will. They'll be able to see more and experience more than the actual player does. The player is just sitting around at a table. And if you think about it, when it comes to all of the feats and the skills and proficiencies and all that kind of stuff, the math that we have to deal with in our game, those numbers, those dice rolls, those probabilities are really just an interpreter between our character and the player. It's the way that the player can understand what the character is going through. And that's a good thing in our games. But anyway, if they understand character versus player knowledge and understand that characters know more than they do in certain instances, then they'll understand metagaming a little better. So that's 3 ways to help your players to work around their own metagaming, the metagaming at the table amongst other players. If none of that works and you as the GM need to do something to mitigate metagaming at your table, here's 5 easy ways of doing that. First of all, you can hide your notes, your GM prep notes that you may have for the session. You can open the monster manual to the wrong character. So if somebody is looking at your information, they're looking at the wrong monster. And totally preparing for something that's not coming at them. Two, and this is my favorite, and I do this all the time in my campaigns, not because of metagaming, but because I think it's more interesting and fun, is to reskin or change up your monsters. Change their armor class, change their hit points, change their physical description, change their resistances, their spells, all that kind of stuff. How much more fun would it be from a story or narrative standpoint, not even including the metagame stuff, if you came across a troll, the only way to stop the regeneration is through cold, instead of fire and acid like it normally is. If cold is the only thing that stopped that regeneration, that would be more fun and exciting. Another thing to think about too, as far as it goes with the actual monster stats, if you, around your table, we're all human. At least they should be all human, otherwise you got other problems other than metagaming, but we're all human. We don't all have the same amount of strength or intelligence or dexterity. We don't have all the same amount of money. We don't all wear the same exact clothes. So why should kobolds be all the same? For example, they run into a group of orcs that were perhaps drinking all night. And when they encounter them in the morning, they're hungover. So their stats are going to be lower than a normal orc would. There's a reason for that. Or maybe the frost goblins have a resistance to cold, and maybe they have a higher hit point value than normal goblins do. This is fun in a game, and it causes interest and buy-in to the game world, but it also helps mitigate metagamers because they don't know. As long as you describe them a little bit differently than a normal orc or a normal goblin or whatever, or give them some specific name, the Briarwood goblins or whatever, that signifies that they are different in some way than a normal goblin. And what you think about goblins, what you know about goblins as a player, may not be what is really going on, and your characters are going to have to figure it out. So I find that very fun. The number 3 way to mitigate metagamers is to use all the resources that are available to you as a game master, especially if you're doing a homebrew session or a homebrew campaign. Use encounters, use NPCs, use ideas from different rule sets, different editions than what you're playing. Use third-party content. Use homebrew content that you'd find online. I use this all the time because I'm running a homebrew campaign. So we use the Pathfinder rule set, as I've mentioned before, but I've used encounters and ideas from D&D 5th edition, D&D 3rd edition, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, regular D20 books, GURPS. I've used some stuff from Call of Cthulhu in my games. I'm taking from a variety of different resources, and that's going to throw everything off for a metagamer because they're not going to know if I take a monster from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and throw them into my world with Pathfinder rules. I need to modify those stats to make it more compatible with the Pathfinder rule set, as an example. So what they may know about a certain monster, even if it's a different edition or something homebrewed that they happen to see online, they're not going to know what's going on. That's going to keep them on their toes. Number 4, subvert the common genre tropes. Now, like I said before, most of us sitting at the table are nerds, and so we read a lot, we watch a lot of movies, we watch a lot of TV in this particular genre that we like to play in as well, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi or horror or whatever. So in your games, if you have a common trope, Like, for example, your players walk into a room in the dungeon and there are a bunch of statues along each wall. What commonly happens in the books and movies that we see and read, or we've played in other games, those statues are going to come to life. You subvert that trope, you twist it, you turn it around so that those statues aren't going to come to life. Well, now what are the metagamer going to do? The metagamer is already assuming that they're going to have to fight these statues, and they're preparing for it, and it doesn't come. Their premonitions about what's going to happen are false. What if trolls don't regenerate? What if all barbarians are not stupid and uncultured? What if they go to a town, you can flip it completely on their head, and you have a barbarian alchemist who runs a very successful apothecary, and they are very, very generous to the artist community in this village. They support the theater. They buy beautiful works of art and statues and all of these kind of things. Just take those common tropes and flip them around every once in a while. Throw things at them that they are not expecting, which basically is going to lead us into our fifth point, and that's improvisation. Improv can be a little more difficult for most GMs to do. Basically, as long as you're not predictable with your improvisation, you're going to be doing good to minimize metagamers. If you're running a module or an adventure path, swap out the monsters that are supposed to be in the adventure path. Find something of a similar challenge rating and also lives in the same kind of terrain as the monsters that are supposed to be in the adventure path. Swap out goblins for kobolds or whatever. When you do that, you're not destroying the game, you're not destroying the story. All you're doing is stopping the metagaming. Like I said before, if they're reading ahead, if they're cheaters and they're just reading ahead in the adventure path and know what they're supposed to come up with, they know that they're supposed to go against goblins, and holy crap, there's kobolds here, there's not goblins, that's going to completely throw them off their game. When you're doing an adventure path or a module, other things that you can do is you can swap the layout of the dungeon rooms. Put them in the position that they're not supposed to be in the actual story. Mix it around. You can change which wall the secret door is on. You can change which room the massive amount of loot is supposed to be in. It's not actually in the throne room like it says in the adventure path. It's in the pantry off of the kitchen or whatever. When you do that, you can easily tell too if a player is metagaming. Now, all that being said, it's impossible to completely cut out metagaming at your table. It just can't be done. It's like sitting in a jury trial for a murder, and the prosecution enters in this evidence, this DNA evidence that the defendant is definitely guilty of this murder. But the judge tells you that that evidence is inadmissible. They did something wrong to get this information, and now you need to disregard it. But you've already heard it. You can't unhear the evidence that this person is guilty. So you can't get rid of metagaming. You can't disregard it. If you understand metagaming yourself and you educate your players, you may be able to get rid of a lot of metagaming. If you know what's causing the metagaming, you may be able to get rid of the source problems to get rid of the metagaming. But you're not going to be able to get it all the way out of your games. And if you think that somehow this video is going to give you some insight that you can just magically wave your hand and all metagaming is gone on your table, then that's just ridiculous. So let's take the wizard's player knowledge of knowing about troll regeneration. So if they decide as a player not to use their meta knowledge, but how many things are they going to have to try before they discover or figure out what actually works against this troll. And that's a whole nother ball of wax with a whole new game, a whole new metagame, to figure out how long they have to wait, how many times they're going to have to fail before they can actually get their meta knowledge. The paladin doesn't use their meta knowledge about the evil thief, but the player will start to try and build a case against this thief. And once they believe that they have enough evidence against this thief, they're going to come out and they're going to act on it. But really, it's still based on the meta knowledge that they have as a player, no matter how they try and spin it. So metagaming is always going to happen in your games, no matter what. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is metagaming isn't limited only to players. We as GMs metagame as well. Now, Guy over on the How to Be a Great GM channel posted a video about GM metagaming, and it got me to thinking, how do GMs metagame and how do we overcome it? Most people will argue that the GM is basically the god of the world. They're the god of the gods of this world, and if they do something, it's not metagaming. But really it is. And here are the 3 levels of GM metagaming that Guy talks about. First of all is GM knowledge. So just like players bringing their information that they have about the physical world into the game, GMs can do that too. And basically Guy says that challenges cannot include meta knowledge to solve, like puzzles or riddles, with modern solutions. Now, puzzles and riddles have been used since the very beginning of RPGs. And many argue that the puzzle or riddle is really for the player to solve and not the character. But remember that character knowledge and skill checks can provide the player with clues. It's that reverse metagaming kind of thing that we talked about earlier, where the character is actually giving knowledge to the player. Another use of GM knowledge is using the rules and game mechanics to tailor encounters to specific PC abilities and skills, either to make an encounter tougher or make it easier for a specific PC to shine during that session. GMs also use meta knowledge with the monsters and how they use them in combat. Now, why would an ogre be sure to stay 31 feet away from the wizard? Because the GM knows that the PC's wizard, their most deadly spell, has a 30-foot range. Now, you could argue that just because that the characters can know stuff about monster weaknesses and strengths, that the monsters could about the PCs as well. And that makes total sense. The monster may say, that guy has heavy armor on. I'm going to go and attack that guy because he looks squishier. That makes total sense. As long as those attacks and actions of the bad guys are reasonable and plausible, you should be pretty okay from a metagaming standpoint. All right, the second level of GM metagaming is GM versus player knowledge. Now, you're sitting around the table, you know that the PCs are going to have to go and attack an orc camp. Now, as the GM, you are sitting there, you are listening to the PCs come up with their ultimate plan to attack that orc camp, right? You know what their plans are. You know what they're going to do. Now, if you change anything about that encounter, if you've already got it done, leave it alone. If you haven't actually made up that encounter yet and you change that encounter based on knowledge that you gained about the player's plans, that's GM metagaming in the wrong way. You're basically taking their plans and negating them because you are metagaming. If you do that on a very consistent basis, none of the plans that the players come up with are going to work. They're going to just fail over and over again, and they're going to get pissed off, and they're going to leave your table. So don't do that. The third thing that he talks about in this video is collective NPCs, or the NPC hive mind. If there's one NPC that has a certain amount of certain knowledge about something, if you as the GM basically give that to all your NPCs now, that's GM metagaming. I always try to ask myself, how did the NPC come across this knowledge? If there's no logical or reasonable way that this NPC could have this knowledge that this other NPC has, then they don't have it. You always should be asking how and why a lot when you're planning out your campaigns, your encounters, all that kind of stuff. How would the NPC have this knowledge? Why would this NPC do this specific thing? So we've given you all kinds of examples of what metagaming is, what causes it, how to get around it from your standpoint and a player's. And then how we as game masters metagame as well. So basically, in summary for this incredibly long video, is metagaming happens. Metagaming will continue to happen. There is nothing that you can do about it. Almost always, we as the GMs are doing some bad planning on our part in our games that cause metagaming to show as a symptom, and we need to fix those problems. Player knowledge is really only metagaming if it translates directly to in-character actions, and only bad if it gives their character an unfair advantage. You also have to remember that characters grew up in this fantasy world, and many of the metagamey things, I just made that word up, are simply common knowledge to them. Like, don't throw fireballs at fire elementals. Duh, they already know this. The level or amount of metagaming that happens in your game is truly irrelevant if everyone at the table is having fun. It only becomes a problem when there's a disconnect with communication, trust, lies, secrets, those kind of things. And basically, it's all like Matt Colville says. It's all about sportsmanship. If you're being a good sport, or if you're being a poor sport. So, like this video, if you found something interesting and you learned from this episode, give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us a comment. How do you feel? Metagaming is a pretty touchy subject for a lot of people. I'd like to know what you think about metagaming, how you go about it as a GM, what you think metagaming is at your table and how you combat it, how it relates to story, how it relates to the narrative. I think if metagaming is good for the story, is good for the narrative of the story, then metagaming is not a bad thing. So let me know what you think down below. Like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the Game Master Vault. All right, so that was a pretty long video all on metagaming. I'm sure I probably missed some things. I'm sure I could elaborate on other little things, but that's really all I have time for today because I am gaming in just a couple hours and I need to go plant some cursed magic items in the world for my players tonight. So, see you, nerds.